Hey guys, tonight we embark on a profound exploration of the human condition, tracing the delicate and often shadowed history of those born with Down syndrome. A narrative that demands we look not just at medical charts, but into the very soul of civilization. As we dim the lights and let the noise of the modern world fade, we must transport ourselves back to an era long before the rigid classifications of genetics, to a time when the world was interpreted through the raw lens of myth, emotion, and spiritual instinct. In the vast, silent expanse of prehistory, before the written word could record a diagnosis, the human eye was the sole judge of difference, and the arrival of a child who defied the physical norms of the tribe evoked reactions that were as complex as they were primal. So we must consider the archaeological silence that covers much of this history, a silence occasionally broken by the most tender of discoveries, such as the excavation in France of a burial site dating back 1.5 millennia, where a child, clearly bearing the cranial distinctiveness of what we now call Down syndrome, was found not cast aside in a pit of shame, but interred with a gentleness that speaks across the centuries. This is a theological revelation as much as an archaeological one, for it suggests that in a world devoid of scientific labels, the human heart was capable of recognizing the intrinsic value of a life, perhaps seeing this child not as broken, but as a quieter soul requiring a softer touch, a life that was loved not in spite of its difference, but within the very mystery of it. But this discovery challenges the cynical view that history is merely a chronicle of cruelty, reminding us that the concept of the imago Dei, the image of God, may have been intuitively understood by our ancestors long before it was theologically codified. As we move from the mists of prehistory into the structured societies of the classical world, Egypt, Greece, Rome, and India, we find that the presence of these individuals was woven into the tapestry of daily life, interpreted through a kaleidoscope of superstition and philosophy. In these ancient epochs, a child born with the soft facial features and gentle demeanor characteristic of this condition was rarely seen as a medical anomaly, but rather as a symbol, a vessel of divine will, or an omen written in flesh. The theologian in me reflects on how the ancients, lacking a grasp of chromosomes, looked to the stars and the gods for explanations, sometimes revering these children as beings touched by the divine, possessing a purity that terrified and awed the common man, while in other, darker corners of the ancient psyche, they were viewed with suspicion as manifestations of ancestral sin or cosmic imbalance. It is a sobering realization that the treatment of these individuals was entirely dependent on the spiritual temperature of the culture and the specific temperament of the family, meaning that for every child raised in the warmth of the hearth, accepted as a karmic teacher or a blessed innocent, another might have faced the coldness of exclusion or the tragedy of exposure. The historical record is sparse, a silence that screams of marginalization, and yet the recurring discovery of respectful burials in regions as diverse as the Andes and Rome confirms a universal truth. They have always been here, an integral thread in the human fabric, neither a modern phenomenon nor a mistake, but a persistent testimony to the diversity of creation. As the classical world crumbled and the medieval era cast its long shadow over Europe, the lens through which these individuals were viewed shifted from the mythical to the dogmatic, and the treatment of the intellectually disabled became entangled with the rigid hierarchies of feudalism and the pervasive fear of the supernatural. In this age of faith and fear, where the church held sway over the interpretation of reality, a child who developed slowly or spoke with a different cadence was often scrutinized for signs of the demonic or the divine, their very existence posing a theological question to their community. The tragedy of the Middle Ages lies in its binary worldview, where the unknown was often equated with sin, leading to the heartbreaking reality that many such children were hidden away, their lives unrecorded, their stories whispered only in the privacy of confessionals or behind the closed doors of rural cottages. Yet, we must be careful not to paint this era with a single brush of darkness, for within the monastic traditions there flickered lights of profound compassion, where monks and nuns, driven by the mandate of charity, often took in those the world had rejected, seeing in their simplicity a closeness to God that the intellectual pride of the learned could never achieve. These innocents, as they were sometimes called, and found sanctuary within the stone walls of abbeys, participating in the rhythm of prayer and labor, their value measured not by their economic productivity, but by their very being. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that even in an age rampant with superstition, love often found a way to triumph over fear, with midwives, parents, and clergy occasionally defying the harsh norms of their time to cherish these children, seeing in their gentle nature a reflection of the Beatitudes. However, as the medieval period gave way to the Enlightenment and the dawn of the scientific revolution, the framework shifted once again, moving from the spiritual to the clinical, a transition that brought with it a new kind of objectification. Now, the narrative brings us to the pivotal and somewhat contradictory figure of John Langdon Down in the 19th century, a man who, while working within the confines of a Victorian asylum, gave the condition its first medical classification. As a historian of science, one cannot help but view this moment with ambivalence. While Down's work shattered the invisibility that had plagued these individuals for millennia, his use of racially charged terminology reflected the prejudices of his empire, inadvertently binding the identity of these people to a scientific racism that would take over a century to unspool. Yet, beneath his flawed taxonomy lay a genuine desire for humane care, a recognition that these patients responded to kindness and structure, a radical idea in an era that often chained the mad in squalor. And this moment marked the birth of the diagnosis, a double-edged sword that granted visibility but also paved the way for the institutionalization that would come to define the 20th century. As the Industrial Revolution accelerated, the world became obsessed with efficiency and productivity, leaving little room for those who moved at a slower, more deliberate pace. And the solution devised by the modernizing nations was the asylum. Sprawling, cold institutions that promised care, but too often delivered isolation. We must pause to feel the weight of this separation, the heartbreak of families told by trusted medical authorities that the best expression of love was abandonment, a lie that severed the sacred bond between parent and child, and removed individuals with Down syndrome from the flow of society, locking them away in facilities where their potential was stifled by uniformity and neglect. The rise of the eugenics movement in the early 20th century represents the darkest hour in this history, a time when the worship of genetic purity seduced governments and intellectuals alike, leading to the forced sterilization and systemic dehumanization of those deemed unfit. This was not merely a political policy, but a spiritual catastrophe, a denial of the intrinsic worth of the human soul, culminating in the horrors of the T4 program in Nazi Germany, where the machinery of the state was turned against its most vulnerable citizens. It is a harrowing chapter that serves as an eternal warning of what happens when science is divorced from ethics and when utility triumphs over compassion. Yet, even in this abyss, there were sparks of resistance, parents who hid their children, nurses who refused to comply, and a quiet, stubborn love that refused to be extinguished by the rhetoric of hate. The post-war era brought a slow, painful awakening as the world, reeling from the revelations of the Holocaust, began to reconsider the rights of the disabled, leading to the birth of the advocacy movement, a revolution led not by politicians, but by mothers and fathers who refused to accept the verdict that their children were lesser. This was the beginning of the journey toward inclusion, a path paved with the courage of families who demanded education, visibility, and dignity, slowly dismantling the walls of the institutions and bringing their children back into the light of the community. As the smoke of the Second World War cleared and the world began to reckon with the atrocities committed in the name of genetic purity, a quiet, but unstoppable revolution began to take root, not in the halls of government, but in the living rooms of ordinary families. This was the era of the parent advocate, a phenomenon that the historian must view as a pivotal shift in the social contract. Mothers and fathers, who for decades had been coerced into silence and shame, began to reject the institutional narrative that their children were defective or burdensome, organizing into grassroots movements that would eventually coalesce into powerful bodies like the National Association for Retarded Citizens, now known simply as the ARC. We must appreciate the theological weight of this moment, though it was a rejection of the idea that human value is determined by utility and a reclamation of the ancient truth that dignity is inherent. These parents, emboldened by the broader civil rights movements sweeping across the United States and beyond, began to demand not charity, but justice, arguing that the exclusion of their children from public education and community life was a moral failure of the state. The passage of the Education for All Handicapped Children in 1975 was not merely a legislative victory, but a cultural watershed, a declaration that the classroom, the very incubator of citizenship, must be open to all. For the first time in modern history, children with Down syndrome were walking through the front doors of public schools, and in doing so they began to dismantle the myths of incompetence that had imprisoned them for centuries. Teachers and peers, often for the first time, encountered the humanity behind the diagnosis, discovering that these students were capable of learning, of deep friendship, and of contributing to the social fabric in ways the cold clinical assessments of the past had never deemed possible. This era of visibility was further accelerated by a shifting media landscape where documentaries like A World Apart began to portray the emotional depth and complexity of life with Down syndrome, moving the public perception from pity to respect. As we moved into the 1980s and 90s, the narrative evolved from one of survival to one of thriving, driven by a medical renaissance that corrected the fatal neglect of the past. It is a haunting fact that for much of the 20th century, life-saving procedures, particularly heart surgeries, were often denied to infants with Down syndrome based on the utilitarian calculus that their lives were not worth the investment, a practice that kept life expectancy tragically low. However, as ethical standards shifted and pediatric care improved, the life expectancy for these individuals skyrocketed from the teens into the 50s and 60s, creating a demographic that history had never before seen. A generation of adults with Down syndrome. This graying of the population forced society to confront new questions about adulthood, employment, and independence, leading to the rise of supported employment and independent living movements where individuals proved they could work in offices, run businesses, and maintain their own households. Perhaps most profoundly, the world began to witness the romantic and relational lives of these individuals, shattering the infantilizing view that they were eternal children incapable of adult love or marriage. We saw the emergence of the self-advocate, a powerful new voice in the public square, where individuals with Down syndrome stood at podiums and declared, "Nothing about us without us," asserting their right to define their own lives. Yet, as a theologian observing the current zeitgeist, I must note a profound and unsettling paradox that defines our modern era. Just as society has opened its arms in inclusion, celebrating models and actors with Down syndrome and integrating them into the fabric of daily life, science has offered a tool that threatens their very existence. The advent of sophisticated prenatal screening has placed expectant parents before a staggering ethical precipice, where the diagnosis of Down syndrome is often delivered in cold, clinical terms, focused heavily on medical risks rather than the potential for joy. In many parts of the developed world, this has led to termination rates exceeding 90%, a statistic that begs the uncomfortable question: have we truly embraced diversity, or have we simply become more polite while privately seeking to eliminate it? This tension between public celebration and private elimination is the defining moral struggle of our time regarding disability. As we conclude this chapter of human history, we are left with the undeniable truth that the story of Down syndrome is a mirror reflecting our own capacity for love and our fear of the unknown. And these individuals, who have been present in every era, from the courts of ancient royalty to the modern classroom, serve as living reminders that humanity is not measured by intellect or productivity, but by connection, kindness, and the ability to love without pretense. Their history teaches us that a society is judged not by its strength, but by how it treats those who require a gentler pace. But the history of what it means to be human is not written solely in our genes or our struggles for rights. It is also written in how we choose to adorn the vessels we inhabit. If the story of Down syndrome is one of inner worth, the history of jewelry is the story of our external expression, a narrative that begins long before the written word, deep in the Paleolithic dawn. And we must cast our minds back over 100,000 years to a cave in Morocco, where the discovery of perforated seashells reveals a startling truth. Long before we built cities or sowed fields, we felt a primal urge to beautify ourselves. This was not a frivolous act, but a cognitive leap, the moment humanity began to engage in symbolic thinking, using the treasures of the earth, bone, shell, and stone, to communicate identity, status, and belonging. To the anthropologist and the theologian alike, these early beads are not mere trinkets. They are the first evidence of the human soul seeking to be seen, a silent language that signaled to others, "I am here, and I belong to this tribe." As we moved from the caves to the great river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt, this impulse to adorn exploded into a sophisticated language of power and the divine. In the Fertile Crescent, gold was not just a metal. It was a substance that mirrored the sun, untarnishing and eternal, making it the perfect medium to represent the gods. The artisans of Babylon and Ur did not just craft jewelry. They crafted talismans of cosmic order, embedding lapis lazuli and carnelian into pieces that were believed to hold the very energy of the stars. In Egypt, this spiritual connection to adornment reached its zenith. The Egyptians did not wear jewelry simply for vanity. They wore it as spiritual armor. The gold upon the pharaoh's chest was considered the flesh of the gods, and every amulet, the scarab for rebirth, the ankh for life, the eye of Horus for protection, was a theological statement worn against the skin. And we see here a civilization that understood the precariousness of life and sought to anchor themselves against the chaos of death through the permanence of stone and metal. Even the dead were bedecked in gold, wrapped in layers of protective charms to navigate the perilous journey of the afterlife, a testament to the belief that identity could be preserved beyond the grave. As the center of gravity shifted to the Mediterranean, to the rational world of Greece and the imperial might of Rome, jewelry evolved from the purely talismanic to the socio-political. The Greeks, with their reverence for the human form, created pieces that accentuated natural beauty, gold wreaths that mimicked the laurel and olive, celebrating the harmony of nature. However, in Rome, jewelry became a loud proclamation of hierarchy and empire. The Roman matron, dripping in pearls from the Persian Gulf and emeralds from Egypt, was not just displaying wealth. She was wearing the map of the empire, a visual testament to Rome's reach and conquest. Yet even the Romans, for all their pragmatism, retained the superstitious core of their ancestors, hiding phallic charms and protective bullae beneath their tunics to ward off the evil eye, reminding us that no matter how civilized we become, we still cling to our tokens of protection. Meanwhile, in the mystical East, particularly in the vast subcontinent of India, jewelry developed into a language so complex it rivaled the spoken word. Here, adornment was and remains a sacred duty, a celebration of the divine feminine. Gold in India was viewed as the embodiment of Lakshmi, the goddess of prosperity, and then to wear it was to invite auspiciousness into one's life. The intricate system of Indian jewelry, from the nose ring connecting the breath to the soul, to the anklets that grounded the woman to the earth, created a holistic spirituality of the body, where every ornament served to align the wearer with the cosmic energies. As Europe plunged into the Middle Ages, the glittering excesses of Rome gave way to a more somber, yet deeply intense, relationship with jewelry. In this age of faith, the primary function of adornment became devotional. The cross, once a symbol of execution, became the most ubiquitous pendant in history, worn by peasant and king alike as a badge of salvation. We see the rise of the reliquary, where jewelry became a vessel for the holy, tiny fragments of bone or cloth from the saints encased in rock, crystal, and gold, and worn around the neck to bring the wearer closer to the miracle of the divine. Yet the feudal system also imposed a strict visual order. Sumptuary laws dictated that only the nobility could wear certain gems, turning jewelry into a rigid boundary line between the classes. It was a time when a ring was not just a ring, but a seal of authority, a legal signature, and often, in the case of poison rings, a weapon. But as the darkness of the medieval period retreated before the light of the Renaissance, jewelry underwent a glorious rebirth. This was the era of the individual, where the focus shifted from the collective church to the human experience. The great goldsmiths of Florence and Paris became artists, treating the pendant and the brooch as miniature canvases. The Renaissance introduced the concept of the sentiment, where jewelry became a keeper of secrets. Lockets holding portraits of lovers, hidden inscriptions of poetry, and symbols of humanism. It was no longer just about protecting the soul or proving status. It was about expressing the unique inner life of the wearer, their loves, their intellectual pursuits, and their taste. This evolution continued into the Baroque and eventually the Victorian era, where Queen Victoria herself turned jewelry into a biography of emotion, popularizing mourning jewelry made of jet and human hair, transforming grief into a wearable art form. As we arrived in the 20th century, the democratization of jewelry through industrialization meant that the sparkle was no longer the sole province of the aristocracy. From the geometric boldness of Art Deco, which celebrated the machine age, to the counter-cultural beads of the 1960s, which rejected materialism, jewelry has remained a faithful narrator of our collective history. It tells us that we are a species that refuses to remain plain, a species that feels a deep ancestral need to take the raw materials of our planet and fashion them into symbols of who we are, who we love, and what we believe. From the glittering external expressions of identity found in gold and gemstone, we must now descend, quite literally, into the bowels of the earth to confront a mystery that lies at the intersection of geology, mythology, and the human longing for the transcendent. On the sun-drenched coast of southern Italy, beneath the shadow of Vesuvius and amidst the volcanic restlessness of the Phlegraean fields, the burning fields of the ancients, lies the sunken city of Baiae. To the Roman elite, this was a place of hedonism and escape, a resort town where emperors and poets indulged in the pleasures of the flesh, but beneath the veneer of luxury lay a darker, more primal association. The Romans, in their spiritual geography, believed this region to be a thin place, a porous border where the membrane between the living and the dead was perilously fragile. It is here, submerged partly by the bradyseism of the volcanic earth and hidden within a hillside, that we find the Oracle Tomb, or the Antrim, a structure that challenges our understanding of ancient religion. For nearly 2,000 years, this site was lost to memory, like a myth whispered in the lines of Virgil's Aeneid, until its rediscovery in the 1960s by Robert Paget, an amateur explorer who stumbled upon what may be the most sophisticated ritualistic complex of the ancient world. This was not merely a tunnel. It was a psychological machine, an architectural masterwork designed to facilitate a descent into the underworld. As we walk with Paget in our minds down that narrow, stone-lined corridor, we are struck by the deliberate engineering of fear. The tunnel is oriented to the summer sunrise, yet it plunges the seeker into absolute darkness, the air growing thick with the smell of sulfur, the brimstone of biblical and classical hells, as the temperature rises with the geothermal heat of the volcano. This was a sensory deprivation tank constructed of rock and steam, designed to strip the initiative of their bearings and their ego. The tunnel's dimensions, the sudden turns that block out the light of the living world, and the oppressive heat suggest that this was the domain of the Cumean Sibyl, the legendary prophetess of Apollo, who was said to guide heroes like Aeneas into the realm of Hades. The theological implications of the Oracle Tomb are profound, for they reveal that the ancients did not view the spiritual world as an abstract concept, but as a physical reality that could be entered, navigated, and survived. The climax of this subterranean journey is a chamber filled with thermal water, a boiling sulphurous stream that Paget identified as a ritual representation of the river Styx, the boundary line of death. We must imagine the terror and the awe of the pilgrim who, after navigating the choking darkness, arrived at this landing, perhaps hallucinating from the volcanic gases, to consult the oracle. Was this a cynical stage set created by a priesthood to manipulate the wealthy, or was it a sincere attempt to map the geography of the soul's journey after death? In the ancient mind, there was little distinction. The ritual was the reality. To descend into the earth was to die, and to return was to be reborn, a cycle of initiation that mirrors the universal human hope for a life beyond the grave. The silence of the oracle. Tomb today, with its submerged ruins and steaming fissures, serves as a haunting monument to the lengths humanity will go to touch the divine, to ask the unanswerable questions, and to peer behind the veil of mortality. And it stands as a testament to a time when we sought wisdom in the dark, believing that the earth itself held the secrets of our destiny. From the depths of the Roman underworld, where humanity sought to conquer the fear of death, we ascend to the dizzying heights of the modern era, where one young woman sought to conquer the limits of the human body. The story of Simone Biles is not merely a sports biography. It is a narrative of resilience that echoes the ancient hero's journey, a testament to the survival of the spirit amidst the turbulence of life. Born in Ohio in 1997, Simone's entry into the world was marked not by stability, but by the chaos of the foster care system, a separation from her biological roots that could have easily severed her potential. Yet, the providence, or perhaps the sheer stubbornness of the human will, intervened in the form of her grandparents, Ron and Nellie, who provided the sanctuary of a home in Texas. It is in this grounding that the flight began. The discovery of her talent was serendipitous, a daycare field trip where a young girl, barely taller than the equipment, felt an intuitive understanding of physics and air. Coaches call it air awareness, the uncanny ability to know exactly where one is in space while spinning at high velocity. But I would venture to call it a vocation. Simone did not just learn gymnastics, she inhabited it. By 2013, she had exploded onto the global stage, not just winning, but redefining the parameters of the sport. In a discipline often criticized for its rigid aesthetic expectations, Simone brought a kinetic power that was undeniable, to performing routines of such difficulty that the scoring code itself had to be rewritten to accommodate her genius. She was the embodiment of the modern obsession with more, higher, faster, stronger, dominating the Rio Olympics in 2016 with a smile that belied the immense pressure resting on her shoulders. She became the Final Five captain, a gold medal machine and a cultural icon, seemingly invincible. However, the true depth of Simone's story, and where it transcends sport to become a lesson in humanity, lies not in her ascent, but in the moment she chose to stop. The revelation of the systemic abuse within USA gymnastics, the trauma inflicted by Larry Nassar, cast a long, horrifying shadow over the sport, revealing that the bodies of these young women had been treated as commodities rather than sacred vessels. Simone's decision to speak out, to become the voice for the voiceless, transformed her from an athlete into a moral force. But trauma takes a toll, and the body keeps the score. When the Tokyo Olympics arrived in 2021, the world expected another coronation. Instead, we witnessed a profound act of deconstruction. The twisties, a terrifying disconnect between mind and body where the gymnast loses their sense of place in the air, struck Simone in the middle of competition. To the uninitiated, her withdrawal might have looked like quitting. To those who understand the fragility of the human psyche, it was an act of radical self-preservation. In a world that demands we sacrifice our well-being on the altar of performance and public expectation, Simone Biles did the unthinkable. She chose herself. She stepped back from the precipice, and prioritizing her mental health over the weight of gold, and in doing so, she gave permission to millions of others to acknowledge their own limits. This was her greatest victory, not a medal hung around the neck, but the reclamation of her own agency. Her return to the sport in 2023 was not a desperate clawing back of lost glory, but a joyful expression of a woman who had healed. When she married and began to compete again, executing the Yurchenko double pike, a vault so dangerous most men do not attempt it, she did so not to prove her worth to the world, but to express the sheer exuberance of her gift. Simone Biles teaches us that true strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to embrace it. She reminds us that we are not human doings, but human beings, and that sometimes the most heroic thing one can do is to stop, long to breathe, and to heal. Her legacy is written not just in the record books, but in the shift of a culture that is slowly learning to value the person over the performance, a lesson as vital today as the ancient wisdom sought in the dark tunnels of Baiae. In the grand lexicon of human history, few chapters are as harrowing or as religiously charged as the one Simone Biles opened in 2018. A chapter that forces us to confront the darkest intersections of power, trust, and the vulnerability of the body. We have traveled from the silent, sun-drenched ruins of Baiae, where the ancients sought prophecy in the vapors of the earth, to the stark, fluorescent glare of the modern gymnasium, and it is here that we encounter a different kind of underworld, not one of volcanic steam, but of systemic silence. When Simone Biles stood before the world, not in a leotard, but in the raw armor of her own truth, and revealed herself as a survivor of the abuse perpetrated by Larry Nassar, she did more than share a personal tragedy. She exposed the rot at the heart of an institution that had promised to protect the very flower of American youth. As a theologian, I'm compelled to draw a devastating parallel here between the institutions of the 19th century that warehoused children with Down syndrome, hiding them away to preserve the comfort of society, and the modern sporting machine that silenced young women to preserve the integrity of a brand. In both cases, the human person was reduced to a commodity, a unit of production or a source of shame, their intrinsic dignity sacrificed on the altar of reputation. Simone's declaration, "Saint, I am not afraid to tell my story anymore," was a prophetic act, a shattering of the false peace that tyranny relies upon. It was a reclamation of the self that echoes the early advocates for the disabled who first dared to whisper, "We are here." She stood in the gap, bearing the weight of a broken system, and in doing so, she redefined the concept of strength. We often confuse strength with invulnerability, with the ability to endure pain without flinching, but Simone taught a generation that true strength is the refusal to cooperate with one's own dehumanization. This courageous truth-telling set the stage for the metaphysical crisis that would unfold in Tokyo in 2021, an event that the annals of sport have termed the twisties, but which the philosopher might recognize as a profound existential dissociation. Now, to understand the gravity of this moment, we must appreciate the gymnast's relationship with reality. For an elite athlete like Biles, the air is not empty space. It is a canvas, a grid of coordinates that she navigates with a precision that borders on the miraculous. Her air awareness is a form of incarnate wisdom, a deep, intuitive knowledge of where she begins and where the earth ends. When the twist is struck, it was not a physical failure. Her muscles were as explosive as ever, but a severing of this sacred connection. She was lost in the air, a soul unmoored from its physical vessel, hurling through the void without a compass. In the ancient world, such a loss of orientation was often described as a spiritual affliction, a dark night of the soul where the pilgrim loses sight of the horizon. And for Simone to admit this public vulnerability, to say, "I cannot trust myself to land safely," was an act of supreme humility. It was a rejection of the modern idolatry of the gladiator, the demand that the athlete must destroy themselves for our entertainment. By stepping off the mat, she broke the covenant of blood that society demands of its heroes, choosing instead the covenant of life. The backlash was predictable. The cries of "quitter" from those who have never known the terrifying weight of greatness, but the support from her peers revealed a shifting moral landscape. We began to see that the gold we chase is worthless if it costs us our soul. And then, the return. The narrative of the hero is never complete without the return, the nostos. Simone's comeback in 2023 was not merely a return to competition. It was a resurrection of joy. When she debuted the Yurchenko double pike, a vault so perilous that it had been the exclusive domain of male gymnasts, she was not doing it to silence her critics. She was doing it, as she said, for herself. There is a profound theological difference between performing for approval and performing from a place of abundance. The former is slavery, the latter is worship. Watching her soar, twisting with a velocity that defies the aging of the athletic body, we witnessed a woman who had integrated her trauma, her triumph, and her humanity into a singular expression of freedom. She was no longer the child prodigy or the victim. She was the master of her fate, wearing her history not as a chain, but as a crown. As we draw the curtains on these four distinct narratives, the silent history of Down syndrome, the shimmering language of jewelry, the subterranean mysteries of the Oracle Tomb, and the soaring flight of Simone Biles, we must ask, what is the thread that binds them? It is the story of the human body, the body as a site of mystery, the body as a canvas for identity, the body as a vessel for the divine, and the body as a battleground for dignity. Consider the child in the 1,500-year-old French tomb. Their body, shaped differently by the dictates of chromosomes, was a question mark to their community, and the community answered that question with love, burying them with the same reverence afforded to kings and priests. This ancient act of grace challenges us across the millennia. It asks us if we, with all our modern science and genetic screening, possess the same capacity to see the imago Dei, the image of God, in that which is different. The history of Down syndrome is a history of our own moral evolution, a test of whether we value life for what it does or for what it is. We have seen humanity fail this test in the cold institutions of the Victorian era and the gas chambers of the T4 program, where the body was judged solely by its utility and found wanting. But we have also seen humanity pass this test in the fierce love of the advocacy movement, in the parents who refuse to hide their children, and in the self-advocates who today stand on the world stage and declare their worth. Intersecting with this is the history of jewelry, the universal human urge to adorn this fragile vessel. From the shell beads of the Moroccan cave to the diamond-encrusted collars of the French court, we see humanity's refusal to be merely animal. We adorn ourselves to say that we matter, that we are connected to the stars, to the gods, to our ancestors. Jewelry is the externalization of the soul's value. When an Indian bride puts on her gold, or a Roman senator his signet ring, or a modern activist their pride pin, they are engaging in a liturgy of self-definition. They are saying, "This body is precious, it is worthy of gold, it is worthy of meaning." It is a defiance of the entropy that seeks to return us to dust. Then we have the Oracle Tomb of Baiae, a reminder that the body is also a vehicle for the transcendent. The ancients did not just think about the gods. They walked into the earth to meet them. They subjected their bodies to heat, to darkness, to sulfur, believing that by pushing the physical form to its limit, so they could break through to the spiritual. This impulse is not so different from what we see in the arena of elite sport. Simone Biles, hurling her body through the air, is also a seeker. She is pushing the boundaries of what is physically possible, touching the edge of human potential. But her story serves as a corrective to the ancient obsession. The Oracle Tomb was a place of danger, a place where one could be lost. Simone's journey reminds us that while we may push the body to the heights of Olympus, we must not lose the person within it. The twisties were a warning that the vessel can break if the spirit is neglected. Ultimately, these stories converge on a single, radiant truth: the inherent sanctity of the human life. Whether it is a life lived with an extra chromosome, a life adorned in the beads of an ancestor, so a life seeking prophecy in the dark, or a life flipping through the stratosphere, the value is constant. History is often written as a list of wars and kings, but the real history is this quiet, persistent struggle to recognize the dignity of the other. We are learning, slowly and painfully, that perfection is not the goal. Connection is. The child with Down syndrome who hugs a stranger with disarming warmth possesses a genius for connection that the isolated intellectual may never know. The gymnast who steps off the mat to save her mind demonstrates a courage that the warrior may never understand. The ancient artisan threading a shell onto a string was grasping for a beauty that transcends survival. As we look forward, we stand at a crossroads. We have the technology to edit the human genome, to select the perfect child, and to eliminate suffering. But in doing so, do we risk eliminating the very diversity that makes us human? Do we risk creating a world as cold and uniform as the institutions we once built? Or will we choose the path of the ancient French villagers, the path of the advocate, the path of the healer, the path that says every life, no matter its shape or ability, is a sacred text waiting to be read? The choice is ours. History has shown us the horror of the alternative. It has also shown us the beauty of acceptance. And as the lights fade on this long journey, from the caves of prehistory to the podiums of Tokyo, we are left with the whisper that has echoed through every age. You are here. You matter. You are loved. We must pause here on the precipice of these interwoven histories to dig even deeper into the soil of our collective conscience, that for the story is not merely about what happened, but about why it happened and what it demands of us now. As we stand amidst the ruins of the institutions that once housed the unwanted and the stadiums that cheer for the invincible, a haunting question arises from the silence. What is the cost of our obsession with perfection? The history of the Western world, from the marble chisels of Phidias in ancient Greece to the gene-editing tables of modern laboratories, has been driven by a singular, often ruthless aesthetic of the ideal. This pursuit of the ideal form, whether in the symmetry of a face, the clarity of a diamond, or the flawless execution of a gymnastic vault, has always cast a long, terrifying shadow. It is in this shadow that the people with Down syndrome have lived for millennia, where we must confront the uncomfortable theological truth that our treatment of the imperfect is a direct reflection of our own spiritual insecurity. When the Spartans left infants with physical differences on the slopes of Mount Taygetos, or when the Romans drowned ill-formed neonates in the Tiber, they were not acting out of mere cruelty. They were acting out of a fear that imperfection was contagious, a blemish on the body politic that might offend the gods of order. The theologian sees in this ancient eugenics a desperate attempt to control the chaos of existence, a belief that if we can just purge the weak, we will finally be safe, strong, and immortal. This is the heresy of strength, the lie that says value is something we achieve through genetic lottery or brute force, rather than a gift bestowed by the Creator. And this tyranny of the normal did not die with Rome. It merely changed its clothes. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it traded the toga for the lab coat. The eugenics movement, which we touched upon earlier, was not a fringe cult. It was the settled science of its day, preached from pulpits and universities alike. It was the logical conclusion of a worldview that viewed the human being as a machine to be optimized. If the machine is broken, logic dictates it must be discarded. This industrialization of the human soul is the great sin of the modern age. When we look at the history of jewelry, we see the other side of this same coin. If the disabled body was the waste of the industrial process, the jeweled body was the product. The diamond, compressed by eons of pressure, became the ultimate symbol of the hard and unyielding perfection we desire. We adorn ourselves with stones that do not age, do not bleed, and do not feel pain, perhaps because we secretly wish to be like them, invulnerable. The colonial history of gem extraction is a history of treating human beings, often in the global South, as less valuable than the rocks they mine. We must ask, how many lives have been ground to dust to provide the sparkle for a royal crown or an engagement ring? The beauty of the jewel is often purchased with the ugliness of exploitation, a dissonance that the historian cannot ignore. The diamond is a mirror. It reflects our vanity, but if we look closely, it also reflects the suffering of the world. And here lies the profound connection to Simone Biles and the modern gladiator culture. The athlete is the perfected human, the one who has seemingly transcended the limitations of the flesh. We worship them because they do what we cannot. They fly. But as we saw in Tokyo, this worship is conditional. It demands a sacrifice. The ancient crowds in the Colosseum did not care if the gladiator was happy. They only cared if he died well or killed well. Similarly, the modern spectator often feels entitled to the athlete's body, viewing their mental health as an inconvenience to the entertainment product. When Simone Biles refused to vault, she was smashing the idol of the perfect machine. She was asserting that the ghost in the machine, the soul, the psyche, the traumatized self, was real and required care. This act of refusal is deeply theological. It resonates with the concept of the Sabbath, the radical idea that we are not made merely for production, that there must be a time to stop, to cease, to simply be. By stopping, Biles forced the world to look at the human being behind the leotard, just as the parents of children with Down syndrome forced the world to look at the child behind the diagnosis. Let us return to the darkness of the Oracle Tomb in Baiae for a moment, for there is a lesson there about the necessity of the descent. The modern world is obsessed with the ascent, climbing the corporate ladder, rising in social status, soaring in athletic rankings, improving the genetic stock. We are a civilization of Icarus, always flying toward the sun. But the ancients knew that wisdom is often found in the depths, in the catabasis. The pilgrim who walked down that sulphurous tunnel in Baiae was doing something countercultural. They were choosing to go down into the dark, again to the heat, into the unknown. In the Christian tradition, and indeed in many great wisdom traditions, the path to resurrection always goes through the tomb. You cannot have the sunrise without the night. The history of Down syndrome is a history of those who have been forced into the low places of society, the basements, the back wards, the margins. Yet, it is often from these low places that the most profound truths about love and community emerge. The L'Arche communities, founded by Jean Vanier, where people with and without intellectual disabilities live together, reveal a joy that is often absent in the high towers of finance and power. This suggests that the upward mobility we prize so dearly might actually be a spiritual dead end, and that the downward mobility of service and humility, qualities often embodied by those with Down syndrome, is the true path to human flourishing. As we look to the future, we face a new and terrifying oracle, the oracle of genetic prediction. Just as the Romans sought to know their fate in the vapors of the earth, we now seek to know the fate of our children in the sequences of their DNA. We have the power to read the future of a pregnancy with terrifying accuracy. But knowledge, as the Greeks knew, is not the same as wisdom. We know that a child will have Down syndrome, but do we know who that child will be? Do we know the laughter they will bring, the lessons they will teach, the love they will inspire? By focusing entirely on the medical defect, we miss the human mystery, and we are in danger of creating a world that is clean of suffering but empty of grace. A world without Down syndrome might be a world with higher average IQ scores, but it would likely be a world with a lower EQ, a lower capacity for empathy, patience, and unconditional love. We must consider the concept of the holy fool in Eastern Orthodox theology, the person who, by worldly standards, is foolish or weak, but who, in their simplicity, shames the wise and reveals the heart of God. If we edit these lives out of existence, we are erasing a vital part of the divine image, a part that reminds us that we are not loved because we are smart or productive, but simply because we are. Furthermore, the story of jewelry and the story of the body converge in the concept of heirlooms. An heirloom is something passed down, and is something that carries the weight of history. Our genetic code is an heirloom, passed from generation to generation, full of variations and mutations. The history of the earth is an heirloom, visible in the strata of the rocks and the gems we mine. But the most important heirlooms are the stories we tell about who matters. For centuries, the story passed down was that the disabled were broken, that the athlete was a god-king, and that the wealthy were blessed. We are now in the midst of rewriting that inheritance. We are learning to treasure the chipped cup, the life that looks imperfect but holds the water of life just as well, if not better, than the golden chalice. Simone Biles, with her focus on mental health, is handing down a new heirloom to the next generation of athletes, the permission to be vulnerable. Now, the advocates for Down syndrome are handing down the heirloom of inclusion, teaching us that a community is only as strong as its care for its most vulnerable member. The Oracle Tomb reminds us that we are creatures of the earth, destined to return to it, and that our time here is a brief flicker in the dark. In this light, the history of the marginalized becomes the history of the center. The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. We are slowly realizing that the history of the great men, the Caesars, the Napoleons, the tycoons, is a history of ego and destruction. The true history of humanity is the history of the quiet survival of the least of these. It is the history of the mother in 1950 refusing to institutionalize her son. It is the history of the artisan in 40,000 BC threading a shell to feel beautiful. It is the history of the young woman in 2021 choosing sanity over applause. These are the victories that matter. These are the moments where the human spirit truly shines, not with the cold brilliance of a diamond, but with the warm, living glow of a hearth fire. As we prepare to move toward the final summation of these entwined destinies, we must ask ourselves, what kind of ancestors will we be? Will we be remembered as the generation that used our technology to narrow the definition of humanity, or the generation that expanded it? Will we be the ones who worshipped the golden calf of perfection, or the ones who embraced the beautiful, broken mosaic of real life? The oracle is silent now. The answer lies not in the steam, but in our own hands. And so we arrive at the final convergence. The point where the threads of the loom are tied off and the full pattern of our human tapestry becomes visible, a pattern that reveals itself not as a linear march toward perfection, but as a complex, spiraling journey toward understanding. We have traversed the silent millennia with the misunderstood souls born with Down syndrome. We have traced the glittering path of our desire to adorn ourselves with the earth's treasures. We have descended into the sulfuric mouth of the Roman underworld, and we have soared into the terrified air with a modern champion. These four narratives, seemingly disparate, are in truth a single story told in four voices. The story of value. What makes a human life valuable? Is it the genetic code? Is it the gold we wear? Is it the mysteries we solve? Or is it the victories we achieve? The historian, looking back over the sweep of ages, sees a painful evolution in our answer to this question. For too long, value was external. It was the utilitas of the Roman state, the productivity of the Industrial Revolution, the purity of the eugenicist, the medal count of the empire. But the silent teachers, those with Down syndrome, those who carved beads in the dark, those who sought wisdom in the earth, and those who dared to stop performing, have whispered a different answer. They tell us that value is intrinsic. It is the pearl of great price that is hidden in the field of the human heart, regardless of whether that heart beats with a rhythm that society understands. We must reflect on the profound irony that as our ability to manufacture perfection has increased, through lab-grown diamonds, genetic screening, and athletic engineering, our hunger for authenticity has deepened. The diamond, once the rarest of stones, can now be created in a plasma reactor in a matter of weeks, indistinguishable from the earth-mined gem. Yet we still crave the stone that has a history, the stone that was forged in the chaos of the mantle. Similarly, we have the technology to edit out the imperfections of the human genome, to create a generation free of Down syndrome. But we must ask if we are also editing out the soul of our communities. The parents who choose to raise a child with Down syndrome today are, in a sense, like the ancient artisans who chose to work with the rough, natural materials of the earth rather than the uniform plastics of the modern age. They are choosing the texture of real life over the smoothness of a curated existence. Yet they are affirming that a life with challenges, a life that requires patience and adaptation, is not a tragedy, but a different kind of masterpiece. The theologian would argue that this is the ultimate act of faith, to believe that the flaw is actually the feature, the very crack through which the light gets in. In the figure of Simone Biles, we see the culmination of the body's history, a body that was pushed to the absolute limit of what physics allows, only to remind us that the mind is the true governor. Her refusal to compete in Tokyo was the modern equivalent of the oracle falling silent. In ancient times, if the signs were not right, if the sacred chickens did not eat, or if the oracle spoke a warning, the army would not march, no matter how powerful the general. That we lost that respect for the invisible signals in our rush for modernity. We decided that the show must go on, that the machinery of commerce and entertainment could not be stopped by something as intangible as mental health. By stopping the machine, Biles resacralized the human spirit. She reminded us that the athlete is not a gladiator owned by the mob, but a sovereign soul. This connects deeply to the history of jewelry. For centuries, women were often treated as the carriers of wealth, trophy wives, draped in the fortunes of their husbands, their value linked to the gems on their necks. But the modern trend of women buying their own jewelry or wearing pieces that symbolize their own stories and struggles represents a reclamation of autonomy. Just as Biles reclaimed her body from the expectations of the Olympic Committee, the modern individual reclaims their identity from the expectations of status. Adornment becomes an act of self-expression, not a display of ownership. we must also revisit the haunting silence of the Oracle Tomb. Why did the ancients go to such lengths to build a simulator of death? Because they understood that to truly live, one must confront their own mortality. They knew that a life lived only in the sunshine, only in the pursuit of pleasure and winning, is a shallow life. The descent into the dark tunnel was a rehearsal for the inevitable, a way to make peace with the shadows. In our sanitized world, we hide death. We hide disability. We hide failure. We hide anything that reminds us of our frailty. And in doing so, we have created a culture of anxiety. We are terrified of the descent. But the history of Down syndrome teaches us that the descent, if we view disability as a descent from the norm, is where community is found. When a family welcomes a child with a disability, they often find themselves descending from the high-speed highway of career and competition into a slower, deeper valley of care, medical advocacy, and simple joys. And there, in that valley, they often find a richness of life that they never knew on the mountaintop. They find that the oracle was right. The wisdom is in the earth, in the grounding, in the basic realities of love and dependency. We are not gods. We are dependent creatures. The person with Down syndrome who needs support to navigate the world is a truthful mirror of our own condition. For none of us is truly independent, and we all need the thread of the other to guide us through the labyrinth. As we close this long meditation, let us look at the jewels of history not as cold stones, but as living souls. The 1,500-year-old child buried in France is a jewel. The thousands nameless victims of the T4 program are jewels, lost in the mud but shining in the eyes of God. The weary pilgrim stumbling out of the Baiae tunnel, gasping for air and changed forever, is a jewel. And the gymnast standing on the sidelines, cheering for her teammates while nursing her own broken spirit, is a jewel. History is the setting in which these jewels are placed. Sometimes the setting is gold. Often it is iron and rust. But the setting does not define the stone. We are the jewelers of the future. We have the power to create a setting that honors the unique cut and color of every human life. We can build a society that does not demand that the diamond be flawless, but celebrates the unique inclusions that make it real. We can build schools that welcome the slow learner as warmly as the prodigy. We can build sports cultures that value the athlete's sanity as much as their score. We can build a faith that sees the entrance to the underworld not as a place of fear, but as a threshold of transformation. The tapestry is finished, yet it is never finished. The needle passes to us. The history of the other is simply the history of us when we are stripped of our pretensions. It is a history that asks us to be kinder than necessary, to be slower than efficiency demands, and to be more open than fear allows. And it asks us to look at the person next to us, whether they are wearing a gold medal, a hospital bracelet, or a simple string of shells, and see them not as a statistic, not as a diagnosis, not as a competitor, but as a miracle. A unique, unrepeatable, ancient, and eternal miracle. The oracle has spoken, the tunnel is open, the vault is landed. The rest of the story is ours to write. Stay kind, stay curious, and never forget that the most precious things in history are not the ones that glitter, but the ones that breathe.